So welcome to my channel again. This is Dr. Emmanuel here. I just want us to do a revision. Excuse me, and that's a very quick revision on the cross anatomy of the ventricular system of the brain. So we'll just go through a few slides and look at what the ventricular system of the brain looks like. So just to begin, I will say there are essentially four ventricles. You've got the lateral ventricles, so you've got a right and left lateral ventricles, which is like first and second. So, and then you have the third ventricle, and you've got a fourth ventricle. So this is one of, this cross section, shows the lateral ventricle there. It's housed within the cerebral. It's a cavity that lies within the cerebral hemisphere. And right there where my cursor is your third ventricle, which is a cavity that lies within the diencephalon. So the diencephalon is also part of the forebrain. So the cerebral hemisphere and the diencephalon make up the forebrain. And then you have your fourth ventricle, which is a cavity that lies within the hindbrain, just behind the pons and the medulla. Okay, so you have the pons here, where my cursor is. This bulge here is the pons, and this lower bulge there is the medulla. And just behind the pons and medulla, within them actually, you have this fourth ventricle. Okay, fourth ventricle. Part of the fourth ventricle, the roof of the fourth ventricle extends into the cerebellum. So if you have a cross section of the cerebellum, you will see parts, like the tenth of the fourth ventricle there. So essentially you have two lateral ventricles, a third ventricle, and then you have a fourth ventricle. Still looking at this picture, you can see this reddish tissue, this vascular tissue is called the choroid plexus. So this is choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle there. And the function of this choroid plexus is to produce cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. If you look there, there's an opening there. That's the interventricular foramen of Monro. So this interventricular foramen of Monro, as you can see on this image, connects the lateral ventricle with the third ventricle. So CSF that is produced from the lateral ventricle flows through this interventricular foramen of Monro into the third ventricle. CSF is actually produced by choroid plexuses in all the four ventricles. So choroid plexus of the third ventricle also produces CSF. So CSF flowing from the lateral ventricle through this interventricular foramen gets into this third ventricle, and the CSF from the third ventricle flows through this narrow channel. You can see how narrow it looks. Okay, this narrow channel is called the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. Okay, or the aqueductal, channel, aqueduct. Aqueduct of Sylvius. So the CSF flows through this narrow channel, and this is of clinical significance because sometimes this channel can be blocked by maybe a tumor or blood clots or pus. In the case of meningitis, you can have something blocking here, or it could be you can have a congenital narrowing, aqueductal stenosis, congenital narrowing of this already very narrow channel, giving you obstructive hydrocephalus. But under normal circumstances, CSF flows through this narrow channel into the fourth ventricle, and then it flows out of the fourth ventricle through these small openings. You can see them there. See an opening there? You can see. So this is the lateral foramen of Loschka. okay, or as it's been called here, the lateral aperture or foramen of Loschka. So you have a right and left lateral foramen of Loschka, and in the middle you have this median foramen or aperture of Magendie. So CSF leaves the fourth ventricle through two lateral foramen of Loschka and one median foramen of Magendie into the subarachnoid space. Okay, into this subarachnoid space. And as we said earlier, all of the four ventricles have choroid plexuses. So the fourth ventricle also has this vascular tissue, choroid plexus that produces cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, and so the CSF flows into the subarachnoid space, and eventually the CSF gets drained by the arachnoid granulations. If it gets drained there where my cursor is now, so it gets drained out of the subarachnoid space into the venous system, to the superior sagittal sinus, into the venous system by the arachnoid granulations. So that's just a summary. So we'll just go through other slides just to help the information sink better. So still an image, just to give credit to where I got this image from. So this is actually from Frank Netter's Atlas of Human Anatomy. So this is a left lateral view of the brain, a phantom view, which just a view that has been designed to show something inside. So you can see the right lateral ventricle, you can see the left lateral ventricle. Okay, so two lateral ventricles, and you can see the interventricular foramen of Monro. So you have a right and left interventricular foramen of Monro. The left interventricular foramen will drain CSF from the left lateral ventricle into the third ventricle, whereas the right interventricular foramen of Monro will drain CSF from the right lateral ventricle into the third ventricle. Okay, yeah, so that's the third ventricle that lies, it's a cavity that lies within the diencephalon or diencephalon, however you choose to pronounce it. Okay, so that's it. And then this is the narrow cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius, and that's your fourth ventricle. Okay, so that's the median foramen of Magendie. So looking at the gross anatomy of the lateral ventricle, you can see the lateral ventricle extends right from the frontal lobe of the cerebral hemisphere posteriorly down to the occipital lobe of the cerebral hemisphere, and you can see it has four major parts. It has the frontal horn or the anterior horn, it has the central part or the body, and it has the temporal horn, or we call the inferior horn, and it has the posterior horn or the occipital horn. So four major components of the left lateral of the lateral ventricle, and this is our third ventricle. Okay, so you can see it has a supraoptic recess, this projection here, and it has an infundubular recess. So supraoptic, an infundubular recess, which means you expect your pituitary gland to be somewhere around there, isn't it? And then you have your suprapineal recess. So we have the pineal recess and the suprapineal recess. We expect our pineal glands to be somewhere there, which pineal gland is part of the diencephalon. So you have your cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius, which we said is of clinical importance. If it gets blocked by anything, tumor, congenital stenosis, blood, or even pus, you could have aqueductal, you can have obstructive hydrocephalus. Let's move on. So just a brief extract from Last's Anatomy by S. Sinatambi, just to read briefly I wouldn't read everything, but so each lateral ventricle is a C-shaped cavity, as we saw, extending, right from the front to as posteriorly as the occipital lobe. Excuse me. Lateral ventricles are lined with ependyma, which is the cellular lining of the ventricles, lying within the cerebral hemisphere. So the lateral ventricles consist of body, anterior and posterior horns, as we've seen. On the medial side, we have the pia mater and the ependyma come into contact with each other. So I think I will just skip all these details. We've essentially looked at the details. You can see choroid plexus, and they're trying to define what the choroid plexus does. So we've looked at this image. Let's see if we can move on. So the diencephalon and the third ventricle, we've said that the forebrain essentially constitutes the cerebral hemispheres and the diencephalon, and we've said that the diencephalon, which has things like the thalamus and some other structures, has a cavity that houses that cavity is the third ventricle, and into which the lateral ventricles of the cerebral hemispheres open through the interventricular foramina of Monro. So reading from where my cursor is here, the diencephalon enclosing this cavity has two side walls, a floor and a roof, and the two side walls are essentially the right and left thalami, or the thalamic bodies. So the floor and roof converge towards each other posteriorly, where they join the midbrain, and the cavity of the third ventricle is continued through the midbrain as the narrow aqueduct. So if you look at it, you'll see that this third ventricle kind of narrows. Well, it may not really explain if we go back. Yeah, it kind of narrows posteriorly, and then continues through this aqueduct of Sylvius. You might not need all of that detail. The most important thing is to understand the broad structure. The minute details may not be very much important, for a student who is, being introduced to neuroanatomy. So I wouldn't dwell so much on those minute details. So the fourth ventricle, don't feel scared by this. I just, copied and pasted from last anatomy. So let's skip this and just, I think let's skip that. Yeah. So this fourth ventricle, you can see, is tent shaped. This is the floor of the fourth ventricle, and this is the superior, the roof. So you can see the superior and the inferior parts of the roof. Okay, so the floor of the ventricle, is made up of the pons, the posterior limb aspects of the pons, and the medulla, and the tent of the roof projects into the base of the cerebellum, and you can see it has a choroid plexus, and it has so important things to know about the fourth ventricle. If you're told to describe it, in an exam, you have to say, okay, it has a floor, the pons, the medulla, it has a tent, the superior and inferior parts of the roof, it has the right and left lateral foramina of Loschka, it has the median foramen of Magendie, CSF flows out, okay? And if you're able to mention these, to be honest, I would say you have done very well. Okay, I would say you've done very well. And let's just read here. They say the floor of the fourth ventricle is also known as the rhomboid fossa. The upper boundaries are the superior cerebellar peduncles. The lower are formed by the gracile and cognate tubercles and their underlying nuclei, and above them by the inferior cerebellar peduncles. A midline groove, the median sulcus, runs from the aperture of the aqueduct of the midbrain above to the commencement of the central canal below. So you can go through your last anatomy, read the details. The essence of this revision is for us to just dwell more on appreciating the gross structure of the ventricular system. So looking at this space in the this is the subarachnoid space. So if you look there, you see it's called the quadrigeminal system. Okay, so there are some systems within the brain, which I'll just mention briefly. If you look there, you see the interpeduncular system. So systems are areas. We have posterior cerebellomedullary system. So within the subarachnoid space, there are places of dilation. There are areas where you have a large space, or what we call dilatations within the subarachnoid space. Those areas are called systems. Okay, they are called systems. So posterior cerebellomedullary system, we've got the quadrigeminal system, we've got the interpeduncular system. Okay, and these systems have clinical importance, which you would get to know when you talk about hydrocephalus. Okay, these systems just give the brain that extra space, extra allowance for accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid before you begin to have problems with raised intracranial pressure. So let's look at this. This is a coronal cross section of the brain that also shows us the lateral ventricle. You can see the right and left lateral ventricles with their choroid plexuses that produce CSF, and you can see the choroid plexuses or plexi are vascular, highly vascular structures. And right there we have our third ventricle, and there's something. This is the thalamus. Okay, the right and left thalamic bodies, and in between you can see what is called the interthalamic adhesion. There between the right and left thalami or thalamuses, you have the interthalamic adhesion. You can see this is a lateral ventricle right up there, and you still have lateral ventricle right down. So the lateral ventricle is a large and extensive cavity, and it's C-shaped, and it extends right from the frontal lobe of the cerebral hemisphere back as posteriorly as the the occipital lobe. So don't be surprised, don't be amazed that you can see some parts of the lateral ventricle there, and also at the top. So I think we've been able to do some quick revision on what the gross anatomy of the ventricular system of the brain looks like. I would just say thanks for being a part of this, and thanks for listening.